everybody a blessed Memorial Day to remember all of the soldiers that have given their lives in all of the wars. And I particularly have ancestors that go back to the American Revolution and the Civil War. And today I'm going to be talking about my great-great-great-grandfather. I wanted to talk about his being mustered in during the Civil War. He's on the roster and records of Iowa Soldiers' War of the Rebellion. Here's the historical sketch of the 13th Regiment Iowa Volunteer Infantry, of which my third great-grandfather participated in these battles. This is a little bit of their history, and you can find your Civil War ancestor easily online. I looked this up to see if I could talk about this today for Memorial Day. Now, this particular great-great-great-grandfather, his ancestors going back to the American Revolution, and his name is Jonathan K. Beam. It was spelled B-E-E-M. Unfortunately, they put an N instead of the M on the roster list, but I did find him anyway, so that needs to be corrected. But they also spelled it B-E-A-M, beam, like a beam of light. And ironically, one of my viewers that came to my channel is Ira Beam. Are we related? I don't know, but also one with my mother's maiden name, two people with my mother's maiden name, which is not that common, also came to my channel just on their own and found me. So today I'm going to talk about my third great-grandfather's regiment. The 13th Iowa Infantry was ordered into quarters by Governor Kirkwood under the proclamation of President Lincoln, bearing date July 23rd of 1861. The organization of this regiment, having completed the quota of the state up to that date, and the 10 companies of which the regiment was composed, were ordered into quarters on dates ranging from September 17th to October 11th, 1861. Now let me just say right here, I was able to find in the Iowa records, and somebody that was into genealogy quite a number of years ago, she lives in Iowa, and she did find photographs of the people who survived that would meet later on after the war, and she sent me pictures of the old men that met together that had been part of this regiment. So my third great-grandfather was in the photo, as well as his brother, Michael C. Beam. So the rendezvous designated in the order was Camp McClellan near Davenport, Iowa, and there the companies were mustered into the service of the United States on dates ranging from October 15th through November 2nd of 1861 by Captain Alexander Chambers, United States Army. And let me just say right here that mustering in and mustering out is when they bring the soldiers together and they are accounted for in their regiment, and they have a roll call and all of that. So it's the date that they're mustered in and brought together as a unit. The total enrollment of muster-in was 890, but this number was soon increased by additional enlistment to 898. The regiment was exceedingly fortunate in the choice of its first commander, Colonel M.M. Crocker, was gifted with the rare military genius. He had the advantage of military training at West Point, the officers and most of the men of his regiment did not fully appreciate the necessity for his rigid enforcement of discipline from the day he assumed command, it did not take them long to discover that he was just the kind of man they needed to instruct them and to fit them for the performance of the stern duties of soldiers who were about to enter upon active service in one of the greatest wars in the history of mankind. The regiment remained only a short time in Camp McClellan. It was transported down the Mississippi River to St. Louis and went into quarters at Benton Barracks, where troops were being concentrated and fitted as rapidly as possible for an active campaign against the enemy. Here it was armed and equipped, and on December 11th was ordered to proceed by rail to Jefferson City, the capital of Missouri, where it remained until early in March of 1862, when it was ordered to return to St. Louis. While the regiment was at Jefferson City, it was mainly engaged in preparation for the great campaign, which was being planned and which was to begin in the early spring. There was no considerable body of the enemy in the vicinity of its camp, and the official records do not show that it met with any loss except from disease. But the death rate from this cause was large on account of the men being unused to the hardships incident to camp life in winter. In addition to the deaths from disease, many became incapacitated for further service and were discharged, and this was the common experience of all troops during their first year of service. Now, before I forget to tell you this part of the story, I did find one of these soldiers' letters, and the soldier was describing how they mustered out and how they went by rail and reached their destination and everything. But one of the things that I had in my own family history records was that my third great-grandfather was a Christian, and he was a member of his church, and he sang in church, and he had a good voice, and he loved to sing. So that was something I connected with, because that music was my whole life, and being a singer and musician and composer and all of that, and percussionist and everything. So it was really neat to find that out. But one of the things that this gentleman had said was that some of the Christian soldiers, they would, like the night before, they got together and they knelt together and prayed for the following day's battle. And I just knew that my third great-grandfather was kneeling on the battlefield, or at the camp before the battles. So this was exciting to me. And from St. Louis, the regiment was conveyed by steamer to Vicksburg Landing, Tennessee, where it arrived March 23rd, 1862. Here it went into camp and was assigned to the 1st Brigade of the 1st Division, commanded by Major General John A. McClernand. The brigade consisted of the 8th and 18th Illinois, the 11th and 13th Iowa, and Battery D, 2nd Illinois Light Artillery, and was under the command of Colonel A.M. Hare of the 11th Iowa, who was the senior officer present for duty. On the morning of the 6th of April, 1862, the rebel army, which had been advancing during the previous afternoon and night, with the purpose of making an attack before further reinforcements could reach the Union Army, was hurled against the advance lines of General Grant's forces, and one of the greatest battles of modern times was to progress. In his official report, Colonel Crocker describes the part taken by his regiment as follows. And it says, Headquarters, 13th Regiment Iowa Infantry Volunteers Camp near Vicksburg Landing, Tennessee, April 8th, 1862. Sir, I have the honor to report the part taken by the 13th Regiment Iowa Volunteer Infantry in the engagement with the enemy on the 6th and 7th. Early in the morning of the 6th, the alarm was given, and heavy firing in the distance indicated that our camp was attacked. The regiment was formed in front of its color line, its full force consisting of 717 men, rank and file. In the meantime, a large force of the enemy's infantry were filing around the open field in front of our line, protected by the woods, and in the direction of our battery, opening a heavy fire of musketry on the infantry stationed on our right and charging upon the battery. The infantry and battery to the right having given way, and the enemy advancing at double quick, we gave them one round of musketry and also gave way. At this time, we indeed, all of our troops in the immediate vicinity of the battery, were thrown into great confusion and retired in disorder, and there remained during the night on our arms. During the day, we were under fire of the enemy for 10 hours and sustained a loss of 23 killed and 130 wounded. On the morning of the 7th, we were ordered to continue with Colonel Tuttle's division and to follow up and support our forces that were attacking and driving back the enemy. We followed them up closely, moving to support the batteries until the enemy was routed, after which we were ordered to return to the encampment that we had left on Sunday morning, where we arrived at 8:00 p.m. Our total loss in the action of the 6th and 7th is killed 24, wounded 139, missing 9, total 172. The men, for the most part, behaved with great gallantry, and officers exhibited the greatest bravery and coolness, and I call special attention to the gallant conduct of my field officers, Lieutenant Colonel Price and Major Shane, who were both wounded in the action of the 6th, and acknowledge my great obligations to my adjutant, Lieutenant Wilson, who during the entire action exhibited the highest qualities of a soldier. Respectfully, M.M. Crocker, Colonel, 13th Iowa Infantry, 1st Brigade, 1st Division. Colonel A.M. Hare, in his official report as commanding officer of the brigade, makes special mention of the gallant commander of the 13th Iowa as follows: to Colonel M.M. Crocker of the 13th Iowa Volunteers, I wish to call special attention the coolness and bravery displayed by him on the field of battle during the entire action of the 6th, the skill with which he maneuvered his men, and the example of daring and disregard to danger by which he inspired them to do their duty and stand by their colors, show him to be possessed of the highest qualities of a commander and entitle him to speedy promotion. The 13th Iowa laid the foundation for its future great achievements. By this bloody baptism in was consecrated, and as it will appear in its subsequent history, the regiment repeated its glorious record at Shiloh in all the battles in which it was afterward engaged. After the Battle of Shiloh, the 13th Iowa was assigned to the 3rd Brigade of the 6th Division. The brigade was composed of the 11th, 13th, 15th, 16th Regiments of Iowa Infantry and was under the command of Colonel Crocker. This organization remained intact until the close of the war, except when upon detached duty, the operation of each of the regiments were identified very largely with those of the brigade, and therefore the history of each of these 4 Iowa regiments is almost inseparably interwoven with that of the brigade. The regiment, with its brigade and division, took part in the advance upon the siege of Corinth, that's Mississippi, and performed its full part in those important operations which ended in the evacuation of that rebel stronghold on the 30th of May, 1862. It then constituted a part of the garrison left in charge of the works at Corinth until about the middle of July, and then participated in various expeditions and was for a time stationed at Bolivar, Tennessee. But the official records do not show that it came into contact with any considerable body of the enemy during the remainder of that summer. After the close of the war, a semi-military organization composed of the survivors of this brigade was organized under the title of Crocker's Iowa Brigade. This organization is still maintained, and it holds biennial reunions, and General W.W. Belknap was its first commander. At his death, Colonel H.H. Rood succeeded him, and at this date, 1908, remains in command of the famous organization. On the 12th of September, the regiment and brigade were again at Corinth, and a few days later marched to join the forces under Major General Rosecrans near Lucca. In the Battle of Lucca, which was fought on September 19, 1862, the 16th Iowa was detached from the brigade and took an active part in that fierce engagement, while the other regiments, 11th, 13th, 15th, were held in reserve and did not participate in the battle. Soon after the battle, the brigade was ordered to return to Corinth. The rebel forces were being rapidly concentrated for attack, and it was evident that another battle was soon to occur at or near that place. And it was also evident that the enemy would make a desperate struggle to regain possession of Corinth, and all the available Union forces were ordered to concentrate for its defense. The 13th Iowa, with its brigade, was engaged in the battle, which was fought there on the 3rd and 4th of October of 1862. Now, this was before my third great-grandfather was mustered in. But what's really fascinating about this is that my grandmother that died in 2021, that lived to be almost 102, she was 101, her family goes back to having a doctor that worked on people during the Civil War, and they were in they turned one of the big buildings with the columns on it into a hospital for the soldiers, but he was on the other side, so that was very interesting. And while the 13th Iowa performed its whole duty in these 2 days of battle, the positions to which it was assigned did not bring the entire regiment into close contact with the enemy. Its loss was comparatively light. Lieutenant Colonel Shane, in his official report, says that Companies A and G were the only part of his regiment actually engaged. And I think his brother was in Company G. Company A, under the command of Captain Kennedy, and Company C, commanded by Captain Walker, were on the skirmish line on the first day of the battle and sustained a loss of 1 man killed and 14 wounded. He further says that the officers and men of those companies behaved in a highly creditable manner, and that the rest of the regiment was held constantly in readiness to engage the enemy, had they received orders to advance. Colonel Crocker, who commanded the brigade, describes the positions occupied by the different regiments, gives full credit to all for having complied with his orders, and explains the discrepancy in losses as resulting from the fact that the 15th Iowa sustained the brunt of the attack on account of its advanced position. The entire loss of the brigade in killed and wounded was 149, and the loss by regiments was, in the 11th, 21, 13th, there were 15, the 16th, there were 27, in the 15th, 86 who died or wounded. And later report, dated at camp near Corinth, Mississippi, October 15, 1862, he describes the part taken by his brigade in the pursuit of the defeated enemy, that the conduct of every regiment, both in the battles and the subsequent pursuit, met with his cordial approval. is indicated in the following extract from his report. The brigade, during the protracted movements of the battle and pursuit, encountering every hardship and privation incident to such campaigning, behaved with great fortitude, meeting every danger and hardship cheerfully, and I acknowledge my obligations to all the field officers for their cheerful, hearty, and intelligent cooperation. The regiment, with its brigade, joined in the pursuit of the retreating rebel army, but did not succeed in overtaking it. After an arduous march, the pursuit was abandoned at Ripley, Mississippi, and the troops returned to Corinth, reaching their camp on the evening of October 11th. After a rest of about 3 weeks, they again took up the line of march with the forces under General Grant and moved south along the line of the Mississippi Central Railroad, the objective point of the expedition being Vicksburg. Now, this just kind of freaked me out because my parents, when I was younger, took me to the battlefield of Vicksburg, and at the time, we didn't have our information about our third great-grandfather having possibly been there at Vicksburg. So I thought that was amazing. I stood on that battlefield with my mom, and it's her family line. The object of the expedition was defeated, however, by the capture and destruction of the depot of supplies at Holly Springs by the rebel General Van Dorn, who, by a skillful movement of his cavalry, succeeded in getting in the rear of the Union Army and compelling the surrender of the troops which had been left to guard the supplies. Thus, forced to retreat to avoid starvation, the regiment, together with the entire Union Army, marched towards Memphis. That was before Elvis got there. I just had to throw that in. He was a little while later. Suffering greatly for want of sufficient rations, they finally reached Memphis and had abundant supply of food on the 131st day of January of 1863. Here the regiment and brigade embarked on steamers and started down the river. January 20th, reached Duckport, Louisiana on the 25th, moved thence to Milliken's Bend, where they landed and went into camp. And here they remained but a short time, and then moved to Lake Providence and engaged in the work of cutting the canal, which was to connect the lake with the Mississippi River. That work was not completed until March 16th, when the great campaign for the reduction of the rebel stronghold at Vicksburg may be said to have begun. During the entire campaign, which ended with the surrender of Vicksburg July 4th, 1863, the 13th Iowa with its brigade performed most arduous and important service, and it was moved from point to point, was part of the time engaged with the Army of Observation in the rear of the lines of Union troops engaged in the siege, watching the rebel force under General Johnston, who was constantly threatening an attack for the purpose of raising the siege, and part of the time with the investing forces in the entrenchments, assisting in the prosecution of the siege, but everywhere doing its full duty and sustaining its well-won reputation for bravery and efficiency. During this campaign, Colonel Hall of the 11th Iowa was in command of the brigade, and Colonel Crocker, having been promoted to brigadier general and placed in command of a division in another part of the Army, Colonel Shane was in command of the 13th Iowa throughout the campaign. During the remainder of the summer, the regiment engaged in various expeditions, the longest and most arduous of which was that under General Stevenson against Monroe, Louisiana. While the troops suffered the greatest hardships upon this expedition, marching through a swampy and malarious region, the results accomplished were not commensurate with the suffering endured. Upon returning from this expedition, September 3rd, 1863, the regiment went into camp at Vicksburg, where it performed garrison duty for the next 5 months. The official records show that from November 30th, 1863 to March 11th, 1864, there were 404 men of the 13th Iowa Infantry who re-enlisted and were re-mustered into the service of the United States for a period of 3 years or during the war, from the date of the expiration of their original term of service, thus giving to the regiment of the title of a veteran organization. On February 4th, 1864, the regiment started on the famous Meridian Expedition, which penetrated into the heart of the state of Mississippi and resulted in the destruction of many miles of railroad track, locomotives, and rolling stock, besides great quantities of supplies which had been accumulated at Meridian for the use of the rebel army. During the expedition, there was much fighting between the Union and rebel cavalry, but the infantry did not become engaged to any considerable extent, and aside from the hardships incident to a winter campaign without tents and living for the most part upon such food as could be procured from the country through which they marched, the suffering and loss of the infantry was small as compared with that of the cavalry, which led the advance. The regiment returned to Vicksburg March 4th, and on the 7th, those who had re-enlisted reserved the welcome order to embark for their homes in Iowa, they having been given a furlough for 30 days to begin upon reaching the state. The non-veterans, those who had not re-enlisted, were left at Vicksburg and subsequently rejoined the veterans upon their return from furlough. Upon the expiration of their 30 days in Iowa, the veteran portion of the regiment reassembled at Davenport, the designated rendezvous, accompanied by a large number of recruits, and proceeded to Cairo, Illinois, thence to Clifton, Tennessee, where they landed and took up the line of march across the state of Tennessee and part of Alabama and on to the mountains of Georgia to reinforce Sherman at Decatur, Alabama, May 27, 1864. The regiment, with the rest of the Crocker Brigade, was attached to the 4th Division of the 17th Army Corps. General Crocker, who had commanded the division, was compelled on account of poor health to relinquish his command and was succeeded by General W.Q. Grisham. The regiment now moved forward with this command to Rome, Georgia, arriving there June 5th, and thence by way of Kingston and Allatoona to Ackworth, where on June 8th, the 17th Army Corps took its place in line with the Army of the Tennessee, commanded by General James B. McPherson, and became a part of the great army commanded by Major General W.T. Sherman, consisting of the armies of the Tennessee, the Ohio, and the Cumberland. One of the greatest campaigns in the history of warfare had now begun, and through it all, the 13th Iowa was destined to bear a conspicuous and honorable part. From June 11th to July 20th, the regiment and brigade were in front of Kennesaw Mountain, participated in the operations there and at Nickajack Creek, and on across the Chattahoochee River to Sandtown, and then passing to the extreme left of the line on the 20th of July, after a heavy skirmish with the enemy, took position about 3 miles from Atlanta. In all of these movements, the regiment had lost a number of men killed and wounded on the skirmish line, but had not been engaged in close combat with the enemy. Now, however, it was again to participate in a series of battles that would leave it decimated in numbers and place it in the foremost rank with the military organizations of the Union. Now, however, it was again to participate in a series of battles that would leave it decimated in numbers and place it in the foremost rank with the military organizations of the Union Army engaged in that tremendous struggle for the possession of the fortified city of Atlanta. In the first of these battles, the gallant Major Walker was a command of the regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Wilson being at that time on detached duty, and Colonel Shane having succeeded Colonel Hall as brigade commander, that officer having assumed temporary command of the division when General Gresham fell, severely wounded. The conduct of the regiment in this battle is well described in the brief report which follows. Headquarters, 13th Iowa Veteran Volunteer Infantry in the field before Atlanta, Georgia, July 21st, 1864. Lieutenant O.D. Kinsman, General 3rd Brigade, 4th Division, 17th Army Corps. Sir, I have the honor to submit the following report of the part taken by the 13th Iowa Volunteer Infantry in the engagement of July 21st, 1864. At 8 o'clock a.m., the regiment was in position in front of the brigade, with the 15th Iowa Infantry on its left and supported by the 17th Iowa Infantry. Its front was protected by temporary works thrown up on the night of the 20th. About 8 o'clock a.m., I received orders for Colonel John Shane, commanding brigade, to advance at once on the double quick to the front to assist Brigadier General Force commanding a brigade in the 3rd Division, 17th Army Corps, who was fighting for the possession of a high hill in his front and to the left of the regiment. The men seized their arms and sprang promptly over the works, advancing in good order to the crest of a hill less than 100 yards from the enemy's works in the face of heavy fire. Here I was ordered to halt and held the position, exposed to a very destructive fire of musketry, grape, and canister until the enemy, having withdrawn to his works, and General Force having gained possession of the hill, I was ordered to retire to the position I originally occupied, which was done steadily and without confusion. Although the men had no previous notice of the advance, there was no disorder, although it was made over an open field with no protection. I regret to say that. Though the engagement lasted but 30 minutes, the loss in officers and men was severe. 17 enlisted men killed, and 4 officers and 77 enlisted men wounded. I cannot close without awarding to the regiment the credit due it for the impetuosity and gallantry of the advance, the stubbornness with which it held the position it gained, and the steadiness and good order in which it retired when ordered. I forward herewith a list of the casualties. So then it says William Walker. On the next day, July 22nd, 1864, and a red letter day in the history of Atlanta campaign and the war at the regiment again went into action, and this time under the command of Colonel Shane. The desperate character of the fighting in that battle is best described by the official report of Colonel Shane, which is here given in full. Sir, I have the honor to herewith submit my report of the part taken by the regiment in the battle of this day. At 12 o'clock p.m., this regiment was in position on the extreme left of the Army of the Tennessee and in support of the 11th and 16th Regiments of Iowa Infantry. Early in the morning of the 22nd, Company F had been detailed by orders from Colonel Hall, commanding brigade, as picket, and as soon as skirmishing commenced on the picket line, 5 more companies were detached by orders from the brigade headquarters, 2 of which were deployed on the right of the 11th Iowa Infantry, 2 on the left of the 16th Iowa, and 1 on the left of the 15th Iowa Infantry, respectively supporting the flanks of those regiments, leaving but 4 companies under my command when the battle commenced. Immediately after the commencement of the battle, and after it had become apparent that the enemy were approaching in heavy forces in front and on each flank, I received orders to move my command to the rear and form in line on the west side of the works occupied by the 1st Brigade, fronting east, from which direction the enemy were approaching. This movement was made and position occupied in good order, but had just been completed when I was ordered to form in line facing to the south, with my left resting on the rifle pits, to repel the enemy approaching from the south. This movement was also made, but scarcely had been completed when the enemy attacked us in the front and in heavy force on either flank. Observing that they were getting into the rear and flank of the 15th Iowa, which was on my right, and that regiment was falling back, leaving my whole line exposed to a front, rear, and enfilading fire, I ordered the command to retire by the left flank across the works and to form on the north side, fronting west, to repel the anticipated assault of the enemy from that quarter. This movement was effected in comparatively good order, but owing to the numerous detachments, independent commands, and stragglers which at that time thronged the road, my regiment was for a short time in some confusion, but order was soon restored, and we formed as directed, but not too soon, as the enemy were then within rifle range and approaching our position from 2 directions in heavy force, when a well-directed fire from the 11th, 13th, 15th regiments routed them in confusion, and for the time being drove them from that part of the field. No sooner, however, had this been accomplished than the enemy were discovered approaching us from the rear in force, when the command was ordered to take position on the west side of the rifle pits, faced by the rear rank, and repel the enemy attacking from the east. This position was soon occupied, and the enemy came on with shout and cheer, and a fierce and desperate hand-to-hand fighting ensued. In a few moments the enemy were driven from the ground and fled in disorder. Then withdrawal from the front was but a signal for a renewed attack from the rear, when the command again crossed the rifle pits, about faced, and contributed materially in repulsing the enemy for the 3rd time. And thus the contest continued until the enemy brought to bear on us at short range a battery, taking our whole line with grape and canister, with terrible effect, when we received orders to take up the position occupied by us on the 21st, where we still are. The 2 companies, A and G, detached at the beginning of the contest and posted on the right of the 11th Iowa, and the 2 companies, D and K, detached at the same time and posted on the left of the 16th Iowa, have failed to report, and I regret to say that from all the information I have been able to obtain in regard to them, I am reluctantly led to the conclusion that about 3/4 of the men composing those companies, while supporting and bravely fighting side by side with the 11th, 16th Regiments, Iowa Infantry, killed or captured, including all the commissioned officers on duty with them at that time. Our loss in officers and men killed, wounded, and missing was very heavy in proportion to the numbers engaged. In the engagement of the 21st, the regiment lost in killed, wounded, and missing 94 enlisted men and 5 officers out of 400 officers and men engaged. And in this day's battle, our loss in killed, wounded, and missing foots up at present 9 officers, 139 enlisted men out of 300 that went into the fight, among whom I regret to say was Major Walker killed, than whom a truer soldier, a cooler officer, and a more steadfast friend and more honest man did not live. His premature and early death has cast a gloom and shadow over the regiment, and a vacancy has been created that but few men can fill so acceptably, so faithfully and successfully as he, ever faithful, ever ready, and he was always the same, a soldier and a gentleman, whatever that means. I cannot close this report without acknowledging my indebtedness to Adjutant Rood, Sergeant Major Myers, and the line officers of the regiment, who aptly seconded and assisted in all the movements of the command, and who bore themselves throughout the trying scene as brave men and gallant officers. And to the non-commissioned officers and enlisted men of the regiment, too much credit cannot be awarded, although repeatedly almost surrounded by overwhelming numbers and subjected at times to a withering fire of grape, canister, and mustery. Not one man showed signs of wavering or despair, but on the contrary, every man clenched his arms with a determination to repulse the enemy at all hazards. Very respectfully, John Shane, Colonel commanding 13th Iowa Volunteer Infantry. Again on July 28th, the 13th, and the little remnant of the 3rd Iowa Infantry under the command of Colonel Shane met the enemy in deadly combat and again nobly maintained the honor of the flag. In his official report of this engagement, Colonel Shane makes special mention of the conduct of Captains J.C. Kennedy and John Archer and commends them for having exhibited the very highest qualities of soldiers and officers, and extols his entire command for bravery and fortitude under the fire of the enemy. Although greatly reduced in numbers, the regiment was constantly on duty during the closing scenes of the campaign, participated in the operations at Jonesboro, Lovejoy, and East Point, and later in the pursuit of Hood as far as Galesville in the northeastern Alabama, returning to Marietta, Georgia, early in November. The regiment's losses during the campaign aggregated 331, about 60% of the number with which it had entered upon the campaign at Ackworth, Georgia on the 8th of June, 1864. Such is the record of heroic service. The original term of service for those who had not re-enlisted being about to expire, they were sent to Chattanooga, Tennessee, and were there mustered out of the service November 2nd, 1864. Colonel Shane, Adjutant Rood, and Quartermaster Kennedy of the field and staff and several of the line officers were also mustered out. And these officers and men had served their country faithfully for 3 years, and the beginning of the end of the war was near at hand. And while they parted from their comrades of the veteran regiment with regret, it was with a feeling of just pride that they reviewed the glorious record that they helped to make, and they returned with honor to their homes in Iowa. Lieutenant Colonel J.C. Wilson was promoted to colonel of the regiment. Other promotions were made to fill vacancies as shown in the subjoined roster. From Marietta, Georgia, the regiment moved to Atlanta, and on the 15th of November started on that great march through Georgia to Savannah and the sea. Arrived at Savannah, the regiment took part in the siege operations before that city, and upon its evacuation, it was among the troops that entered the city on the 22nd of December, 1864. On January 6th of 1865, the regiment embarked on steamer and proceeded to Beaufort, South Carolina, where it arrived the next day. From Beaufort, the regiment marched to Pocataligo, where it remained until January of 29th, when it started on the long and toilsome march through the Carolinas. On the 17th day of February 1865, a detachment of 75 men of the 13th Iowa, under command of Lieutenant Colonel Kennedy, entered the city of Columbia, the capital of South Carolina, and planted the colors of the regiment on the dome of the Capitol. Continuing the march from Columbia, the regiment reached Bentonville, North Carolina, and it took part in the Battle of Bentonville, but was not closely engaged, though it had 3 men wounded on the skirmish line, and this was its last battle. At Goldsboro, North Carolina, the regiment found a large number of recruits from Iowa waiting to join it. The long march was continued by way of Raleigh, Petersburg, and Richmond, and ended at Alexandria, Virginia, near Washington. May 19th, 1865, a few days later, the regiment took its place in line and marched down Pennsylvania Avenue in that magnificent review, the greatest military pageant of modern times. After the review, the regiment remained in camp near Washington until June 7th, when it was conveyed by rail to Parkersburg, Virginia, and thence by steamer to Louisville, Kentucky, where it remained until July 21st of 1865, and on that day was mustered out of the service of the United States, and a few days later it was conveyed to Davenport, Iowa by rail, and there on the 29th day of July, 1865, the regiment was disbanded and the survivors returned to their homes. In the adjoined roster will be found a brief personal record of service of every officer and enlisted man of the regiment, insofar as such record was obtainable from the official records in the office of the Adjutant General of the state of Iowa and in the War Department at Washington. The difficulties encountered in making up these revised rosters are explained in the introductory article of this volume, and it's particularly to be regretted that the record of battles in which each soldier was engaged could not have been recorded opposite his name in the roster, but as only the names of those who were killed, wounded, captured, or missing, or those who received special mention in the official reports, appear in the records, and as only a minority of those who survived at the close of the war were living in the date of this compilation was undertaken, it was found impossible to make these records of personal service as comprehensive as they might have been made had the work been undertaken soon after the close of the war. The compiler, in order to keep within the prescribed limitation of a brief historical sketch, has given only the outlines of the history of this splendid military organization, but he has endeavored to preserve the most conspicuous feature of its service. The state of Iowa sent many regiments into the field during the Great War of the Rebellion, and without an exception, they rendered heroic service and reflected great honor upon the Commonwealth. Among them all, the record of the 13th Iowa Infantry Volunteers stands conspicuous. None rendered more effective or important service. Those of future generations who can trace their lineage back to one of these heroic soldiers may justly claim an ancestry that has no superior among those who have achieved military fame and honor in any age or country. Their loyalty and devotion and the supreme sacrifices they made will not be forgotten, while true patriotism and brave deeds are honored among men. And in this list of soldiers is my third great-grandfather. And I just love that statement right there. I just want to read that one more time. Those of future generations who can trace their lineage to one of these heroic soldiers may justly claim an ancestry that has no superior among those who have achieved military fame and honor in any age or country. So these men were so superior in character, and it's written in the record of the Civil War of the 13th Iowa Volunteer Infantry, and my third great-grandfather was in Company B. And it touches me so to realize he was a church-going believer in Jesus Christ. He was a singer in his church. He loved to sing, and he prayed on the battlefield, and he prayed in the camp before battles with his men and fellow soldiers. And had he not lived, had he died on the battlefield, I would not be here. My mom would not have been here. my grandmother would not have been here. I'm meant to be here for some reason, hopefully to continue to bring honor to Jesus, our Lord and Savior, our King. This is part of my mother's lineage, and I'm proud of it. His name is down below. They spelled his name wrong, unfortunately. They put an N instead of an M, so it should be Beam, B-E-E-M. Jonathan K., age 29, residence Marion County, Nativity, Indiana. Enlisted November 21st, 1864. Mustered November 21st, 1864. Mustered out July 21st, 1865 at Louisville, Kentucky. And I was just watching the Kentucky Derby there, not knowing that he had been there at the, that's where he mustered out. That was at the end of the war. That's where they then went home from that point to Iowa and went back to their homes and their lives. He was a very honorable soldier and a man that was full of integrity, full of the love of Christ, and I'm just so grateful to God for this heritage. And yes, I can say I can trace my heritage back to this Civil War soldier, my third great-grandfather. Do genealogical research on your family line and find out your family surname's meaning, because you'll find out just some really extraordinary things. Who would ever guess I was able to find out, you know, from letters that another soldier had written, that they knelt on the battlefield and prayed, and, you know, at the camp before they went into battle. All the Christian soldiers got together and prayed together. And he lived, and I'm here to tell his story. One more thing that it says about the 13th Iowa Infantry, that it was organized at Davenport, Iowa, and mustered in for 3 years of federal service between October 18th and November 2nd of 1861. Its troops came primarily from the Iowa counties of Lynn, Jasper, Marion, and that's where my third great-grandfather was from, Marion County, Lucas, Keokuk, Scott, Polk, Benton, and Marshall in Washington counties. So that's just one of my ancestors' service records, and each battle goes into details, so I'm not going to go into each one of those, but just his general overview of what his regiment participated in. God bless our military. God bless everyone who has served to try to keep evil at bay and try to keep a godly legacy for this country. Bless all of our military and their families, and don't ever forget their service, and don't ever forget what they've done. Even if you're inexperienced at any of the history, it really is incumbent upon you to keep their memories alive. And by the way, before my mother passed away, I found someone that would go find his grave, take pictures of his tombstone for me, and they happened to take them when they had a flag for Veterans Day by his grave. So that was kind of neat. He was born in 1835 and died 1928 at age 93. One of the things that was really astonishing to me is that I knew that there was another brother who was a Civil War drummer, and you know, I'm a percussionist, so that meant a lot to me. When I went to see the Fredericksburg battlefield one time, they could look up the whole history of your ancestors' regiment, and then they could do a printout, and you know, they have books in there that they can Xerox and give you a copy of. Now you can just look it up online, so it's really neat. But at the time when I was looking up these two brothers, I had said to myself, I sure wish I could find a connection to that Civil War brother. Right after I got home, somebody saw my post on the genealogy site, and it was the descendant of that brother that was able to send me pictures of that third brother that had been the Civil War drummer. So it was astonishing how that happened, and I don't believe anything's coincidence. I will see you in the next video.